Memorial Day was always bittersweet for me. My father, a veteran, had died when I was a teenager, and every year since, I'd attended the town parade in his honor. But this year, something felt off. The parade had been announced like always, with posters plastered across town. Yet, when I arrived at the main street, the atmosphere was strangely subdued. It wasn't the usual crowd of families and kids waving flags. Instead, the people lining the street were oddly quiet, their faces pale and solemn, almost waxy. They barely moved, standing in eerie silence, their gazes fixed on the empty street ahead. I found a spot near the corner bakery, the place my dad and I had always stood together. I glanced at my phone, 10:58 a.m. The parade was set to start at 11 sharp. I scanned the crowd, searching for anyone I recognized, but none of the faces seemed familiar. That was strange. I'd lived in this small town my entire life. At exactly 11 a.m., a distant drumbeat echoed down the street. The sound was faint at first, but grew louder, reverberating in my chest. The crowd remained silent, their eyes fixed forward, unblinking. I turned to an older man standing beside me and asked, "Do you know who's marching this year?" He didn't answer. He didn't even look at me. The drumbeat grew louder, and then I saw them, the marchers. At first, they seemed like any other parade troop. Soldiers in old uniforms, flags held high. But as they drew closer, something about them unsettled me. Their movements were stiff, almost mechanical. Their uniforms weren't just old. They were tattered and stained, the fabric hanging in shreds. And their faces, God, their faces. They were pale and gaunt, eyes sunken deep into their sockets, skin stretched tight over their bones. Yet they marched in perfect unison, their empty gazes fixed straight ahead. The flags they carried were frayed, the colors faded almost to gray. The crowd didn't cheer. No one clapped. They just stood there, watching in silence as the procession passed. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I recognized one of the marchers. It was my father. His uniform was the same one he'd been buried in, the metals glinting faintly in the sunlight. But his face was wrong. It was hollow, lifeless, and his eyes, they didn't see me. "Dad," I whispered, stepping forward. He didn't stop. None of them did. The parade continued, a never-ending line of soldiers, each one more ragged and decayed than the last. I saw men and women from every war, their uniforms marking the passage of centuries. Revolutionary War coats, Civil War tunics, World War helmets, all worn by figures who should not have been walking. I turned to the crowd again, desperate for some kind of explanation, but they remained frozen, as if trapped in a trance. And then I heard it. A voice, faint and distant, whispered in my ear, "Asterisk, you shouldn't be here. Asterisk." I spun around, but no one was there. The parade stretched endlessly down the street, the drumbeat growing louder, almost deafening. I backed away, my heart pounding, but when I turned to leave, I found the street behind me was gone. There was only more parade, more marchers, stretching into the horizon. I was trapped. Panicking, I pushed through the crowd, shouting for help, but no one reacted. They stood like statues, their faces blank. And then I noticed something horrifying. The people in the crowd weren't just watching the parade. They were becoming part of it. One by one, they stepped off the curb and joined the marchers, their movements stiff and jerky, their faces draining of color. A young woman in a sundress stepped forward, her eyes wide with fear, but as soon as her foot touched the street, her expression went blank. Her dress faded, replaced by a blood-stained uniform. She disappeared into the procession. I felt a pull, an invisible force dragging me toward the street. The voice whispered again, louder this time, "Asterisk, you shouldn't have come. Asterisk." I fought against it, digging my heels into the ground, but the pull was relentless. My feet slid forward, inch by inch, until my toes touched the pavement. The world seemed to blur, the drumbeat pounding in my ears. And then everything stopped. The parade, the crowd, the sound gone. I was standing in the middle of an empty street, the sun shining overhead. The town was silent, completely still. But something had changed. The posters announcing the parade were gone. The storefronts looked older, their signs faded and weathered. My car, parked just down the street, was no longer there. And the people, there were no people. I ran to the nearest house and pounded on the door, but no one answered. Every house I tried was the same, abandoned, as if the town had been empty for decades. I don't know how long I wandered, calling out for help, searching for someone, anyone. But as night fell, I heard the drumbeat again, faint and distant. I turned toward the sound, and there they were, marching toward me out of the darkness. This time I didn't resist. Memorial Day weekend had always been a quiet affair for me. This year, I decided to escape the bustle of the city and drive to my late grandfather's cabin in the woods. It had been years since anyone in the family had visited, and the idea of solitude seemed perfect, at least at first. The cabin sat on the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The air was crisp, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. I parked my car, unloaded my bag, and stepped inside. The smell of aged wood and faint mildew greeted me, along with the eerie silence of a place long abandoned. As I settled in, I noticed an old, dusty journal on the bookshelf. It wasn't my grandfather's handwriting, but someone else's, a meticulous scrawl that seemed out of place. Flipping through the pages, I realized it wasn't a journal at all, but a logbook filled with dates, times, and strange notes like *10:03 p.m., lights in the clearing. 11:15 p.m., whispering voices. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. May 30th, 1974, something is watching. Don't look outside after midnight. It was dated exactly 50 years ago to the day. I tried to brush it off as someone's imagination or a joke, but as night fell, the woods around the cabin grew unnervingly still. The kind of stillness that feels unnatural, like the world is holding its breath. Around 10 p.m., I heard a faint rustling outside, followed by a low hum, almost like a deep, resonant chant. My heart pounded as I peeked through the window. The clearing was bathed in a pale, bluish light, but I couldn't see a source. I told myself it was moonlight, nothing more. But the hum grew louder, almost rhythmic, vibrating through the cabin walls. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, determined to prove to myself that it was nothing. The clearing was empty, but the light remained, casting long shadows that danced across the trees. That's when I saw them, figures just at the edge of the forest. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching. I stumbled back inside and locked the door. The journal's warning flashed in my mind. Don't look outside after midnight. But curiosity clawed at me, refusing to let go. By 11:59 p.m., the hum had become a deafening roar, shaking the cabin. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound, and I felt a strange pull, as if something was urging me to step outside. Midnight came, and the hum abruptly stopped. Silence enveloped the cabin, heavier than before. I crept to the window, unable to resist, and peeked through the curtain. The clearing was empty. The light was gone. Relieved, I let out a shaky laugh, but then I saw it, my reflection in the window. Only it wasn't moving. It stared back at me with wide, unblinking eyes, a sinister grin slowly spreading across its face. The next morning, I woke up on the cabin floor, the journal clutched in my hand. The last page had changed. Scrawled in fresh ink were the words, "You looked. Now you belong to them." I ran to my car and sped back to the city, but something followed me. At night, I hear the hum outside my apartment, growing louder each day. And in every mirror, every reflective surface, my reflection lingers a second too long, smiling that same, twisted grin. Now Memorial Day approaches again, and the hum hasn't stopped. I can't tell if I'm awake or dreaming anymore, but one thing is certain. This time, they're coming for me. For as long as I can remember, Memorial Day has been synonymous with Lake Greywater. My family spent every holiday there, grilling burgers on the shore, laughing as we skipped stones, and watching fireworks light up the still, dark water. But this year, for the first time, I went alone. The lake had become a place of grief for me. My younger brother, Nate, a Marine, drowned there last Memorial Day. It wasn't a tragic accident. It was something we couldn't explain. One moment, he was on the dock, laughing with me. The next, he was gone, dragged under so fast I barely had time to react. The police ruled it a freak accident, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Nate was a strong swimmer, and the water had been perfectly calm. I hadn't been back since, but on the anniversary of his death, guilt pulled me there like a magnet. I needed closure. I needed to feel his presence again. The lake looked the same as it always had, eerily still, the surface like glass. The tall pines surrounding it whispered in the wind, their reflections rippling faintly in the water. But something about it felt different. Heavier. Colder. I sat on the dock, the same one where I'd last seen Nate. The air was unnaturally quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The lake mirrored the sky, its dark depths betraying no movement. I couldn't help but think of all the times Nate and I had jumped off this dock, competing to see who could make the biggest splash. Now, the thought of touching that water made my stomach churn. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I lit the lantern I'd brought with me. The faint glow illuminated the dock and a small patch of water around it, but the rest of the lake remained shrouded in darkness. I pulled out Nate's old dog tags, which I'd brought with me. Running my thumb over the worn metal, I whispered, "I miss you, Nate. I'm so sorry I couldn't save you." The words hung in the air, swallowed by the silence. And then the water moved. At first, it was subtle, a faint ripple spreading out from the center of the lake. But as I watched, the ripples grew larger, more violent, as if something massive was stirring beneath the surface. I stood up, gripping the lantern tightly, my heart pounding. "Nate!" I called out, my voice trembling. The water stilled again, the surface smoothing out as if nothing had happened. But then I heard it, a faint splash followed by another, closer this time. I squinted into the darkness, holding the lantern high, and saw a figure emerging from the lake. It was a man, wearing what looked like a tattered military uniform. Water dripped from his clothes as he stepped onto the shore, his movements slow and deliberate. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were empty, hollow. Who are you?" I stammered, backing away. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised an arm and pointed toward the lake. Behind him, more figures began to rise from the water. Men and women, all in various states of decay, their uniforms marking them as soldiers from different eras. World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, some I didn't even recognize. They moved in eerie unison, their eyes fixed on me. Panic surged through me, but my legs felt like lead. The soldiers stopped at the edge of the dock, forming a silent, unmoving line. One of them stepped forward, a woman in a Civil War-era uniform, her face gaunt and sunken. She opened her mouth, and a raspy voice escaped. "Why have you come here?" I wanted to honor my brother," I said, my voice shaking. "He drowned here last year. I just wanted to feel close to him again." The woman tilted her head, as if considering my words. Then she said, "Your brother is with us now." The world seemed to tilt beneath me. "What do you mean?" He's dead." She pointed to the lake, and as I followed her gaze, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Another figure was rising from the water. This one was familiar, too familiar. "Nate," I whispered. He looked just as he had the day he died, but his eyes were different, dark, lifeless. He stepped onto the dock, water streaming from his uniform, and stopped in front of me. "Why did you come back?" he asked, his voice flat, emotionless. Tears blurred my vision. "I needed to see you. I needed to know what happened." Nate stared at me for a long moment before saying, "They don't let us leave." "Who?" I asked, desperation clawing at my chest. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and pointed toward the center of the lake. The water began to churn violently, and a massive shape started to rise. It was a monument, a towering stone obelisk, covered in moss and barnacles, its surface etched with names. Thousands of names. "What is that?" I whispered. "The Lake of the Forgotten," Nate said. "It takes those who are lost, those who are forgotten by the world. It took me, and now it's calling you." "No," I said, shaking my head. "I'm not staying. I won't let it take me." But the soldiers began to close in, their hollow eyes locking onto mine. Nate stepped forward, his expression softening for just a moment, as if the brother I had known was still somewhere inside him. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "Once you see the lake for what it is, it doesn't let you leave." "I didn't know," I choked out, gripping his dog tags so tightly they bit into my palm. "Nate, I didn't know." "You have to go," he said, stepping closer. "Now, before it takes you too." The soldiers began to murmur, their raspy voices blending into an eerie chorus. Their words were unintelligible at first, but soon I could make them out. Asterisk, "Stay with us. Join us. Forgotten but together. Forgotten but together." Asterisk. The chant grew louder, drowning out everything else. The air grew colder, and the water behind them began to boil, sending up clouds of steam that smelled of rot and decay. The obelisk in the center of the lake seemed to pulse, glowing faintly with an unnatural, sickly green light. I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. Something was pulling at me, a force I couldn't see, dragging me closer to the water's edge. I fought against it, digging my heels into the wooden dock, but the pull only grew stronger. "Nate!" I screamed, tears streaming down my face. "Help me!" He hesitated, his face contorting in anguish. For a brief moment, his eyes flickered with something human, something real. He reached out and grabbed my arm, his cold, wet hand wrapping tightly around my wrist. "I'll try," he said, his voice breaking. "But it's already too late." The soldiers surged forward, their hands clawing at me. I felt icy fingers grip my arms, my shoulders, pulling me toward the water. Their hollow eyes burned into mine, and I saw something terrible in them, a hunger, a desperation that went beyond death. I thrashed against them, screaming, but their grip was unyielding. My feet slipped off the dock, and I felt the icy water engulf me. It wasn't like normal water. It was thick, heavy, and it seemed to cling to my skin, pulling me down. "Nate!" I screamed again, choking as the water rose to my chest. "Please!" He stepped forward, his face twisted in pain. For a moment, I thought he was going to save me. But then he stopped, his expression hardening. "You don't understand," he said, his voice distant. "Once you're in the water, you're part of it. You're part of us." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're my brother. You can fight this." He shook his head slowly. "I tried. I fought for a year, but the lake doesn't let go. It owns me now, just like it will own you." "No!" I screamed, thrashing harder, but the water had reached my neck. I felt hands beneath the surface now, dozens of them, pulling me deeper. The soldiers on the dock stared down at me, their faces emotionless, their chant echoing louder and louder. Asterisk, forgotten but together. Forgotten but together. Asterisk. As my head slipped beneath the surface, the cold consumed me, seeping into my bones. The world above grew distant, the light of my lantern dimming until it was swallowed by the murky depths. And then I saw them. Beneath the surface of the lake, there were more, hundreds, maybe thousands of faces staring back at me. Some were soldiers, their uniforms tattered and decayed, but others were ordinary people, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. They drifted in the darkness, their mouths moving silently, as if screaming for help no one could hear. I felt myself sinking deeper, the water pressing in on all sides. My lungs burned as I fought for air, but there was none. The lake wasn't just water. It was alive, and it was pulling me into its heart. In the distance, I saw the obelisk glowing brighter now, its surface covered in names that shimmered like ghostly fire. As I was dragged closer, I realized the names were moving, shifting, rearranging themselves. And then I saw my own name appear at the very bottom. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. This was it. This was what had happened to Nate, to all of them. The lake didn't just take you, it erased you. It swallowed your name, your identity, your very existence, leaving nothing behind but a hollow shell to join its army of the forgotten. I fought harder, desperate to escape, but it was no use. The hands beneath the surface tightened their grip, pulling me closer to the obelisk. My vision blurred, and I felt my mind slipping away, piece by piece, like sand slipping through my fingers. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was Nate, standing on the dock, staring down at me with tears in his hollow eyes. And then I was gone. When the search party arrived at Lake Greywater the next day, they found my car parked by the shore, my lantern extinguished on the dock. But there was no sign of me, no footprints, no evidence I had ever been there. Weeks later, when they held a vigil at the lake, a local historian pointed out something chilling. The obelisk in the lake's center, visible only during the lowest tides, was a monument to soldiers who had been lost in battle and never recovered. But as he spoke, someone noticed something strange. There was a new name carved into the stone. My name. And now, as Memorial Day approaches again, I can feel it. Deep beneath the surface of the lake, I am still here, drifting with the others. Waiting. Watching. And soon, the lake will call someone else.